So what we have scattered out here is all the parts for a PO1 standard lockwork decocker, the Pro package. All the factory parts we've put in this little bag here rolled up. We'll put this in the customer's case. It's a good idea to keep this stuff because these parts, some of them can be used for spares. Keep in mind, you've got the original retaining pin, so if you damage that, you do have an extra one in there. Trigger return springs in here. There's all kind of things that can get you out of jam. So it's a good idea, even though they're factory parts, to keep that on hand for an emergency. So I'm not going to show the polishing at this point in time just for time constraints on the video, but I will tell you what I did. We'll show polishing in another video later. And I start by assembling all the systems together. We've polished the tops of these humps because it does ride against the slide. And then we've polished the tops of these. We've also hit the sides, and I just did 400 grit here because mainly you're just kind of deburring the edges here. And in this one, you'll see that we've polished back here. And the reason I've done this, I don't like to polish there, but I use a tungsten scribe, and I just lightly drag it across this edge and across this edge, these two edges here. This is where your disconnector rides. So when you're pulling the trigger, the disconnector pushes right there, and eventually it has to disconnect. And so if you have burrs, and as you run this over here, if it picks, if it actually catches a burr, you need to cut that down. But you have to be really careful not to round these edges, because a round edge here is going to make the gun stack. You're going to pull the trigger, and it's going to crunch to a double action. Even if you have a mirror shine, if these edges aren't sharp, you're hurting the double action trigger pull. So another thing that we've done is kind of bevel this edge down here. You'll notice on your trigger bar, it's probably beveled 90% of the way around, and just the very corner's not done. And most triggers in the gun will not use that full range of motion, but I like to go ahead and bevel that just in case, because you can see now I can move this all the way back, and it just flops around like it should. If you don't bevel that, you'll be able to push the trigger like that, and it sticks right there in that end. And so we're going to take the trigger bar, the trigger return spring, and you'll see the long leg. I hold it up, and you just kind of push it in and separate this. And I'm going to hold it just like this and take a slave pin. Grab one from over here, and then just push it right in there. Now, if you don't get it, most of the time you can go all the way through. If you don't get it all the way through, it'll stay in. I'll take a little dental pick and push it in and actually work it over, because that'll allow you to bend the spring and push it right where you need it to go. And so that's the entire trigger assembly that you'll drop into the gun. We'll set that off to the side. Next comes the part everybody loves, is on the hammer. Now on the hammer, what I've polished is I've taken a diamond file, really rough, and gone through and cleaned this area up in here. And that's just to make sure that when these holes were drilled, that none of the metal got pushed in there, because your disconnector and your strut are going to ride in that area, and you want them to flop around freely when you install them. And so I'm going to take my hammer pins, and it's going to be really hard to tell, but our hammer pins now are tapered on one end. And it looks like this end right here is the end that's tapered. You're not going to be able to see that on the video, but you'll find that if I flip it over, that doesn't want to go in. But if I flip over the tapered end, I can just set it in there and it's going to stay. And so I'm going to start with my disconnector. And you have to be kind of careful. You can take this back out if you want to and line it up really close, because what you don't want to happen is as you drive this through here, you don't want this to hit the edge and create a burr in there, and then it jam up the disconnector. The disconnector needs to flow, it should just flop around. So I'm going to line the holes up really carefully. I'm going to drop the pin in there, give it a good whack. Now it's in there. And the important part here is that we set it on something steel. If you were to put this on a roll of masking tape or a wood block or even a plastic bench block that looks like this, it's going to absorb too much of the energy. And so I'm going to take my starter punch here and finish driving it in. And you don't have to kill it, but you're gonna hit it, deliberately. So we're gonna set that there, and so just like I said, that should flop around. That's a good fit there. And so on the disconnector, what I've polished, I just took a sanding drum and I knocked down the edge. I didn't want any sharp edges because this actually rubs against the bottom of the sear cage here, just like that. Well, actually from the back side, but anyway, just like this. And so I even like to bevel this corner a little bit, because if this wasn't cast or machined smoothly and you have a sharp edge, and some of the guns that can dig into that corner, so I like to bevel that a little bit. And on the top of this disconnector, you don't want to remove any material in the very middle, but you can kind of make it dome shaped and it'll ride a lot smoother right in there. And so the next thing we're going to do is the hammer strut. Now the hammer strut's not as important because the hole's a little bit bigger. There's a little bit more room for error, but we're going to put the pin in here just to get it started. And then on the hammer strut, what we've done is I filed this flat, and it's just so I can lay this on my bench block flat. This doesn't really even have to be polished. The important part here is that it's straight. You'll see that this is a stamped out part, so it has kind of rough edges down here. And what happens as it gets stamped out, especially right here in the center, sometimes it'll have a bow to it. And so when the hammer spring is on this, it actually tries to sit like that in the gun. Not that bad, but it sits like that. And so you can feel, when you pull the trigger, you can feel the strut rubbing against the spring. So a lot of people will polish this all the way down, but really all that needs to happen is you'll set it flat. If you see daylight under here, I just take it like this, give it a little tap, a little bit harder than that, to actually bend that back down, and I keep laying it out until I get it relatively flat. It doesn't have to be perfect. And this one I've already fixed. So we're just going to set it in here. All right, that made it. Just going to do that. And it's always best to hammer these in. You don't want to press it in, because if you put this in a vise and you try to press that pin in and it doesn't go in perfectly straight, this hammer is so hard that you'll break it. And we will warranty it against wear, but if you stick it in a vise and break it, that voids the warranty. So there's my hammer assembly. Now for the part everybody really loves is the sear cage. And the only thing I've polished on this sear cage are these pads and this ramp. And so I don't even really use a Dremel much for this. What I normally do is take a knife sharpening stone, and I take some sandpaper, and I just polish this like this and like this to keep these flat. It's really important that everything here stays flat. And so after I do that by hand, I do use my Dremel with 2000 grit sandpaper just to go shine it up. Polishing isn't going to do a whole lot, but it does help a little bit in those areas. And so to assemble the sear cage, what we're going to do is we're going to insert it from the right side, just like we look at the right side, because this is how it sits in the gun if I were shooting. And we're going to take the flat end. You'll see the slave pin is round on one end and flat. I'm going to insert the flat end, and I'm going to press my thumb up against this so that it doesn't fall out. And so these tweezers that I use, I've actually cut myself a couple of grooves in here so that I can reach down here and grab this lifter spring, and I'm going to turn it just like this, and I'm grabbing it in this little groove that I've got, so I can actually pull on it pretty well. And I'm going to slide it onto the slave pin here. The next thing I'm going to do, and you can kind of see that I've got the slave pin about halfway across there. So we're going to slide the lifter on, and on the bottom I'm using my middle finger to push against it so nothing can fall out. You can turn this however you want to. Now I'm going to position this lifter spring, and I'm going to reach through with my tweezers and grab it at an angle. And that groove allows me to grab that and really pull on it, and I lay it in that groove. And now all you have to do is just slide it over, and boom. If your lifter spring, I'm going to push that. If you have a good lifter spring, it won't go anywhere. If your lifter spring is so weak, when you let go of this, it falls out, you need a new lifter spring. So the very next thing we're going to do is going to take the sear, and I just do lightly brush the bottom of the sear, because when the gun is working, this does, when the slide goes back in double action, the hammer hooks will ride up and kind of push the sear up a little bit. So I do polish that. So we're going to drop this in here, and I'm going to use my fingernail to hold that as I push the slave pin in about halfway. And then I'm going to turn this up on the end to let gravity work with me a little bit. And I'm going to slide the decocker lever in. Line it up. Now I'm going to take the sear pin that came in the gun, and slide it through and kind of wiggling it to make sure that it goes in there. Now this can't go anywhere. So I'm going to push this through so that I've got that nice gap in between and both these pins holding the sear cage together. And when I swap my grip, I'm going to push against these pins as I pinch the sear cage, and that allows it to, so that nothing can come loose. And we're going to start with the Decocker spring. And I like to grab it just like this, how it sits in the gun, with this leg hanging down, this 90-degree turn down and pointed back towards me. And we're going to slide it in here. And normally I would turn this up on end, but I'm going to put my finger down there to hold it in place so that you can watch this. And then I'm going to hold tension with the tweezers as I push the slave pin in, and now I have the slave pin holding that in place. And then we're going to take the sear spring, and the long leg goes forward, and we're going to drop that down in there really careful. And so now we're going to push down a little bit as we push the sear pin in, the slave pin. And the next part is really, nothing can come out. We just kind of have to move it around, wiggle it a little bit until everything kind of lines up and you can push the slave pin all the way in and the sear pin drops out. The last step is to get this Decocker spring behind the Decocker lever. Now you have to be really careful with this, because if I just came up here and bent really and pulled really hard, it would bend this leg and create some problems. So I'm going to try to keep this turned down as low as I can. And it's going to bend it a little bit and work that behind there. And so that's good. When you get everything together, it all works. Now, one thing I did forget to tell you, on the lifter, all of this is a good idea to make sure before you assemble this, make sure the actual sear pin goes through the sear cage and it goes through each one of these levers smoothly. A lot of times with these lifters will be made, there might be a burr in the hole. Sometimes when you punch this out, the punch will hit some of the edges and create a burr, and so you need to check that, because everything works really well right now because it's got the slave pin in there, but the slave pin is about 0.010 of an inch less diameter than the sear pin, so of course it's going to work good. And so now that we have these three things put together, we're ready to start putting them in the gun. And so I like to start with the trigger assembly, and I'm just going to put a little bit of oil on here as we get started. Just like to wipe this. And it just drops right in. We're going to kind of line up the hole here, and it works out good because the slave pin is hollow. So when I get it close, I'm going to hold it in there and just use my Delrin side of my mallet, knock it on through. And you should be able to push it about flush. And you'll see sometimes this leg doesn't fall down in that groove. You need to make sure you get that in there. So we're going to pull it over. And that's butter. We're good. The next thing is going to be the hammer. So I like to put a little bit of oil right under here. It doesn't really matter what oil you use, as long as you use something. There are some things out there that get really thick in the gun that I don't care for. But for the most part, any oil is going to keep your powder residue soft and make it easier to clean. So we drop the hammer down in there. And we're going to take the hammer pivot pin and install it. Just kind of wiggle it around, get it pushed all the way in. And then your number 19. And be careful, because this number 19 pin is just a touch shorter than a hammer pin. When you put this number 19 pin in, you shouldn't have to push real hard. It should at least be flush with the top of the frame. If it sticks out at all, you've got the wrong pin in there. And then I like to oil a little bit down here on the bottom of the frame where the disconnector rides. Get a little bit on the back of the trigger bar and a little bit on top of the disconnector. And then we're going to put the sear cage in here. And so if you went through and made sure that this pin went through all these levers real smooth, you shouldn't have any problems here. And so you'll notice this pin, you've got a chamfered edge. It's beveled, and on this end, it's just a little bit round, but it's got a sharp edge. This chamfered end has to go in first. And it only goes in from this side of the gun. You should never draw it out or drive it out from this side, because you can damage this. This pin is not made, it doesn't fit in that hole. If you do accidentally drive it out of here, you can actually we use a pin gauge and set it on top of that hole that's too large, and you can hit that and push some of that metal back down into the hole and fix that. But we're gonna drive this in here. I'm gonna take my Delrin side of my mallet real quick, and that drove the pin out, went all the way through, and look at there, my lifter still works. So we're gonna finish driving this pin in. Not real hard, just want to make sure it seats. And then we're going to take the number 63 little retaining washer and get it started. I'll push this back out through here and just gently tap it. You don't want to hit too hard. Be real careful, because if this punch slips, you're going to gouge the side of your frame, and we don't want to do that. And so then the decocker lever goes in. It's going to snap all the way in, except you're going to have to push the decocker lever down just a little bit to get it to go all the way through. And then we're going to install the hammer spring. Now, you'll notice that our springs, they aren't sanded on ends. And this really doesn't matter a whole lot, but I like to rotate this spring. I don't want this end being in the very front or the very back. I like it turning to where it's on the side. And you'll notice that the ends kind of line up. And so it's on the side there too. It just seems to help the gun out a little bit when you turn the spring like that. Sometimes, especially in a compact, you'll go to put it in and it'll get bent. And then you'll pull the trigger and you'll hear some squeaking because the spring's rubbing a little bit. If you'll take that spring out and flip it upside down and put the bend further up, that'll usually go away. And so now that's a fully assembled working frame. Decocks, everything works. The last thing you want to do is check your trigger bar tension, and you can see the trigger bar support spring. The right side should rest about close to the top, and so I'm just gently going to tuck that over there, and the left side should just barely touch the bottom, and so that does. So we're going to set them in there, and that's important because the reset on the gun. So when the slide cycles, it pushes the trigger bar down. It's back here, and when you let the trigger out, it resets. If your trigger bar tension isn't right, you're going to get a couple of different resets in there that you'll hear. But that's all working really well. So we're going to set this to the side and continue on with the slide here. First thing we're going to do is put the firing pin spring on the firing pin, and then the firing pin block spring on the firing pin block. Some of these are a little tight, and they don't want to get started, but it's all right. You just kind of twist it a little bit. This is an area that I like to put a little bit of oil in and in here, but I never put oil in the actual firing pin channel. These little voids, they grease them from the factory because it's just a pocket of air, and you can get some rust in there if you don't add some oil. But once you have that done, you can put the firing pin in there. I don't like using oil in there because that just takes away from some of the impact that you get, and this firing pin is not going to rust. So what I have here is another Decocker Sear pin, and this is what I use for a slave pin. So you have to make sure that you get this lined up right, and so I'm going to push down on a little bit, and then I'm going to use the firing pin to kind of push over on the side of it to make sure that it lines up and the firing pin is going to go all the way in. So we're going to slide that all the way forward, and then as I hold that in, I'm going to drop that in there, and that keeps it all assembled. And this hole is just slightly smaller than a 1/8 punch, and so it's really difficult to find stuff that'll fit in there, but the Decocker Sear pin just works perfect. So what I'm going to do is we like to turn this pin so that the slot in it is facing 12 o'clock straight up, and then I'm just going to get it started, and then I'm going to set it back on my rubber bench block, and then I'm going to put a piece of faux leather here over the slide to make sure that if I hit that, I don't damage the slide. When I pick it up, take my slave pin back out, and then we're going to finish that off with a 3mm punch. And you want to make sure that you keep it centered, because if it slips, you'll hit that hole. You'll hit your serrations and kind of ding them up. And we like to make sure that it's perfectly centered. Just a little bit more. Doesn't really matter, it just looks nice. And so now the slide is pretty much assembled. I'm going to put a little bit of oil around the barrel here. And I'm kind of putting weight all the way around this barrel as I cycle it through, get it working good. And another thing that we did is we did polish the feed ramp, and then I took my knife sharpening stone and I rubbed the bottom of the slide. And you'll see there's still some black areas here, but I hit all the high spots. And that's just going to make the slide feel a lot smoother as it cycles. And we use grease, and I'm just using this tiny little paintbrush. I use grease to get down in the rails. And that's the only place we put grease in the gun. So now this is ready to assemble. Put your slide on, slide stop. And that's a nice trigger pull. At this point, we would normally go ahead, put the mag guide in, the grips back on, and you're done.